Asking for advice, mastering the use of ought to. Hello, language learners. Welcome to another exciting episode in our intermediate grammar series. Today, we're going to delve into the wonderful world of modal verbs, specifically the use of ought to when asking for advice. This versatile modal verb can help you sound more natural and fluent in English, so let's get started. First off, it's essential to understand what we mean when we say ought to. It's a modal verb that we use to give or ask for advice. It means roughly the same thing as should. For example, you might say, "You ought to study before the test," which means it would be a good idea to study. However, when asking for advice, the structure changes slightly. We would say, "What ought I to do?" or "What ought we to do?" This may sound a bit formal, but don't worry, it's perfectly acceptable in many situations. When forming a question with ought to, we start with what, followed by ought, and the subject. I, you, we, they, etc. And then, to do. Here are some examples. What ought I to do about my missing homework? What ought we to do to prepare for the presentation? Remember, while this is a bit more formal, it's still common in certain situations or in written English. So, it's a great tool to have in your English toolkit. Now, what if you want to ask for advice on what not to do? You can form a negative question with ought to by adding not before to do. Here's how you can do it. What ought I not to do when visiting England for the first time? What ought we not to do to avoid getting lost in the city? It's the same as before, but with not included to ask for advice on what you should avoid. In more informal settings or casual conversation, should is often used instead of ought to. You may hear questions like, "What should I do?" or "What should we do?" These sentences mean the same as the ought to versions we've discussed but are a bit more relaxed and common in everyday speech. However, understanding ought to will still help you in formal situations and improve your overall grasp of the English language. And there you have it. Now you know how to use the modal verb ought to when asking for advice in English. It's a handy tool to have, and while it might feel a bit formal, it will certainly help you sound more polished and fluent. Practice makes perfect, so keep using it in your English conversations. We hope you found this video helpful. Until next time, keep learning and keep practicing. Remember, you ought to continue practicing to master your English skills. Happy learning!